Okay, it's 9:50 and it's time to start right now. Welcome everybody to the 8th annual AZCALL conference. It's being held online, fully online, and I started Monday, October 11th, and today is the day for all live plenaries and sessions. We're going to have presentations by Dr. Julie Sykes. Then we're going to have a panel about teaching and learning languages during and post COVID-19 times. And then we're going to have Dr. Susanna Abrams with the closing plenary for the day. And then we're going to have a fun networking activity for everyone. So right now I'm going to have Dr. Brian Smith. Dr. Brian Smith from Arizona State University is one of the founders of AZCALL and serves as our current faculty advisor. Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Blanca. So I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome the over 250 participants across 5 continents to the final day of the 8th annual AZCALL conference. And we have, as Blanca said, 2 keynotes today, as well as a panel on L2 teaching and learning in times of COVID and hopefully beyond COVID. After the final keynote, again, as you just heard, we'll have a virtual social gathering and spatial chat. Check the main website for that link and a short tutorial if you don't know about spatial chat. And all of the presenters have agreed to join us later today, so you'll have a chance to interact with them and other attendees. It's very easy to navigate, very self-explanatory, so just go ahead and give it a try. So please look at the agenda for details. Also, as you know, the pre-recorded presentations, as well as today's keynotes and the panel should be available for a few weeks after the conference, provided we secure all the required permissions from everyone. And so quickly, I would just like to thank all of our participants, presenters, invited speakers, and a very special thanks goes out to the AZCALL Organizing Committee and our sponsors, of course, and a very, very special thanks to a couple of people, Michael Winans, who maintained our conference website and a bunch of other things, and to the Call Club president, Blanca Romero, who did a wonderful job with organizing and facilitating all aspects of the conference, despite her looming PhD exams. And at this point, I'll hand it over to Blanca, who will introduce our first keynote. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. So our first keynote is Dr. Julie Sykes. We are incredibly excited and honored to have her here, and I have my notes here. So Dr. Julie Sykes is an associate professor at University of Oregon. She's also the director of the Center for Applied Second Language Studies. She earned her PhD from the University of Minnesota in 2008. Her current research focuses on transformational approaches to the teaching and learning of second language, more specifically, the teaching and learning of intercultural pragmatics. Her interdisciplinary research also draws upon theoretical and applied linguistics, discourse analysis, psychology, educational gaming, game design, and cultural anthropology. Dr. Sykes' experience includes design, implementation, and evaluation of online immersive spaces and the creation of place-based augmented reality mobile games to engage language learners in a variety of non-institutional contexts. She has published several articles on related topics, including synchronous computer-mediated communication and pragmatic development, gaming and second language acquisition, task-based learning, and interlanguage pragmatics. Among others, her most recent publications include meaningful integration in professional communities, examining user behaviors in Catalyst. This was 2021 in Calico Journal. She was one of the authors. Also 2021, 10 Research in Digital Discourse, in second language pragmatics. This was in new directions in second language pragmatics. And last year, technology enhanced L2 instructional practices. This was the University of Hawaii National Foreign Language Resource Centers. And these are just few of her 2020-21 publication. And I want to ask everybody to help me welcome Dr. Julie Sykes.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. And thank you, Blanca, for the wonderful introduction and the welcome. I think, let me just share my screen as I get going. Hopefully that will work, no problem. All righty. All right. Can everyone see what I am sharing with you? We should be good to go, correct? All right. Let me, all right, there we go. I just want to be sure everyone can see. Are we good to go there? All right, perfect. Sorry, there are lots of windows. I won't be monitoring the chat right now, so if someone has a question, please feel free to jump in. We should be good to go there, and thank you so much for the invitation. Again, we're going to talk about a look at mixed reality, the use of emerging game technology and language learning. I'm excited to talk about this work, one, because it is a bunch of new stuff that we've been working on, and I would say it is a combination of all the things that we have been learning about games, but also the place that it can be really, really tricky to try to decide what's an emerging technology versus what is something we've known for a long time and how does that work. Also, it's really exciting to get to talk about something that started with many of you in this room, either with students of mine who are now at Arizona, so it's so nice to see you, or even long ago. You all may or may not know this, but I did my master's degree at Arizona State, and so it's great to come home, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Also to the Castles team, before I get going, I should say the team that I get to work with here at the University of Oregon and the center I work with, Stephanie and Christopher and Mitra, among others, is remarkable. And I'm really lucky to get to do this kind of work as we get going. So there have also been many, probably thousands by now, participants in these different experiences. And so a huge amount of gratitude to them. And this image is a nod to Calico as being one of the very first places where we did this kind of work. This is in Montreal a few years ago, and diving into kind of this mixed reality space. We are going to do three things today. One is really going back to the basics. As we've been talking about, and I've been researching mixed reality, and what we want to do is, what do we need to assume about language? And what do we need to assume about play and games in order to think about kind of the next step of this emerging technology and what we want to do? Also, being cautious to divide this work into different types of mixed reality experiences. Much like any other learning experience, we can't group all of them together. And so it becomes really fundamental to decide how they get split apart and what might be beneficial for certain parts of language and what might be beneficial for other parts of language, and what do we do with that. Finally, some pillars of design and implementation. My hope is you could walk away today with hundreds of different questions you want to ask. The truth is, we don't have a lot of answers yet. We're really just diving into the empirical data in this area. We're starting to see other data emerge around digital games and other spaces, but when we think about kind of meshing together the analog and the digital like we do out in the real world, there are a lot more questions than answers. And so the project of the design pillars was really about what are our theoretical guiding principles as we go forward, and then setting out a research agenda on what we need to do with those going forward if we want to keep thinking about mixed reality and games as experiences kind of that go together. Some of you have seen this before. I kind of pulled back into some of my vintage slides for this presentation as I was preparing. I'm like, no, back to the basics really is back to it. These are my kids a few years ago. And I just am going to ask you to think for about 20 to 30 seconds, what do you see here? Kind of what behaviors do you observe? Maybe you remember having me use this slide before. Even better, recycling is one of our key features of learning. But what do you see? What kinds of behaviors different things again as we're going. All righty, I'm just going to let people think, and then I will talk about it momentarily here. Alrighty. If you've typed in the chat, that's great. I can't see it with these windows and the way they're overlaid, but I'm super happy. Maybe I'll hit on some of the pieces that we're talking about. These are the kinds of things I see and the kinds of things that I think about. And really, when we're building experiences for learners, whether it be kids and small children all the way through to adult learners, is how do we create conditions under which these things happen, right? Hypothesis testing. I think this might happen if I do this. And what does that look like? Meaningful collaboration. How do we get language learners not just talking with each other, but together doing something with that language? Also risk-taking. We know that risk-taking matters. Good language learners take risks all the time. Often when my students ask me, what does it take to be a really good language learner? My response is often, well, it takes a lot of bravery, right? A lot of guts just to get out there, to try things, to experiment with language, to do different work as we're going through. Also, large amounts of playtime. We have lots and lots of theories about second language acquisition, lots of approaches, lots of people disagree on what's happening. What we can see in common across most of those, and Steve Thorne, among others, have said this, is large amounts of time, right? Effortful engagement and learning matters. And what I see with games, and often sort of get attributed to addiction or properties, but is large amounts of playtime. When you're doing something that matters, you really do spend time working with those. And then finally, problem solving. If you've ever imagined trying to decide who gets to scan the food and beep the food at a children's museum, it's a problem that has to be solved when you're little. But similarly, right, anytime we're diving into deep learning and deep inquiry, we want learners to be set up to solve their own problems and not just sort of walk through various steps as they're going. Also, I want to be really clear about my assumption about language. It is not that other approaches are invalid. It is more of a yes and approach. We need all kinds of research happening. We need to think about language in lots of different ways. But when thinking about instruction, when thinking about the kinds of learning experiences I'm hoping to create for my learners, as well as the kind of experiences we're teaching teachers to create, is really placing co-constructed dynamic interaction at the core of language teaching and learning. And what I mean by that is it becomes exceedingly important to prepare them for language patterns they've never seen, dialects they've never encountered, different language varieties or accents. And it requires then, yes, there's patterns, absolutely. There are things that are the same across the board, but there are also all kinds of dynamic situations. And so in my case, I've taken the approach of looking at that from a pragmatics perspective, looking at how meaning is both interpreted and communicated, how we're ensuring our intention is communicated across those lines, but also knowing that that can change, right? So instead of saying in Spanish, you need to do this, this, and this, the question becomes, well, actually in Spanish, most typically when you're leave taking, you need to have 2 or 3 pre-closers. However, you might run across people who like to end conversations sooner. And in that case, you might want to do this. The trick is the reality of teaching learners to do all of those things at once becomes really, really tricky. And so we need models and tools that set them up for the skills to be able to figure that out on their own, which again takes us back to this notion of ambiguity and tolerance to that risk. I want to show you this example. These are my kids later in school. This was during the pandemic, where we saw a lot more continued kind of exploration of this work and ways that play actually facilitated that, right? And so we're starting to see this happen in learning environments in that way. One huge outcome in many cases was that learners were doing these kinds of things. You'll see on the left, this is my oldest daughter doing a simulation around a life raft. She had to decide what she was going to take on her life raft and how she was going to decide and who got to go with her. And then they used that to talk about math and physics and literacy and rescues and all kinds of things. Also way over here on the far right, that's my youngest doing a word search, but it's not just a word search. I don't know if you can tell what's happening, but on the Zoom call, she is racing her grandpa. So they both have the same word search, and she is willing to dive into this literacy work, essentially, right? Read words, find them, decode letters, which is a big deal when you're working through, and using play to get her to do that over and over and over again. It certainly wasn't a manipulation, but the notion that play enables us to do this deep inquiry is really, really important. Now, as we go back to more traditional or more typical, we might say schooling environments, often what happens is we go back to things like what you see in the second picture here, where it's worksheets to fill out, or we take sort of that play experience out of it. And that can be a challenging sort of move. It's something that we're seeing back in these sort of formal walls of the classroom this year, is we've done all these really creative, engaging things online, and now how do we bring that back? And working with mixed reality, one of our goals was, well, we actually need both, right? There's this world that's happening that is both digital and analog. It's very difficult to separate them. And we want to really rethink pedagogy as we work in that space. And so this requires kind of a new centering of what we think, knowing what we know from motivation theory, some of the work in psychology and economics and business around autonomy, mastery, and purpose, Dan Pink's work. Knowing that to really motivate people, it's not about fun, it's not about sticks and carrots, it's really about getting them to do things they care about. And they've done a number of empirical studies looking at this motivating property, and really found that, things like grades or things like money in their case are not the things that get learners really deeply engaging. And so how do we sort of capitalize on that notion of motivation? Hopefully the motivation is to communicate in a bunch of different languages all around the world, but also to try to solve things and try to do something in the immediate moment that feels like you're moving forward in your language learning process. Also creating instances that are pedagogical for active cognitive engagement, and at very high levels of cognitive engagement, moving away from this kind of one-to-one answer response, which we need, drilling has to happen, but embedding memorization, embedding really discrete point work in higher order thinking skills in higher order spaces. Also ensuring that we are privileging process as we work through what this pedagogy looks like. So giving scores not only on the high stakes exam or the high stakes assignment at the end, but really evaluating how learners engage in the learning process and valuing those who take risks, and saying, hey, if you want to try out these really complex linguistic structures that you haven't looked at before, here's how we can do that in this particular assignment, and here's how it won't have a negative impact on the work that you're doing. And so those are kind of some of the basic assumptions from a very large scale pedagogical space, but also why play, right? We talked about this. Play is one way. If we're talking about this particular pedagogy, we're talking about how we recenter, put learners at the center of what's happening. Play becomes increasingly important. We can use it to avoid attrition and burnout. We can build 21st century skills. In a number of the experiences I'm going to show you today, we look at multimodality and the way that language works both in digital and non-digital spaces. Preparing for an uncertain future. I think maybe we all have that lesson more than we wanted in some ways, but things change all the time. Even pragmatic behaviors that I might have instructed on for learners in virtual environments 3 years ago are different. Take, for example, a Zoom call, a typical Zoom meeting. If you think about how it starts, we all jump on the Zoom call, and especially at the beginning of the pandemic and throughout the first half was, oh my gosh, how are you doing? How's everything happening? And inevitably there is a critical move in English that moves from the introduction phase to the quote unquote business phase. That was a pattern, right? So someone says something like, I know it's kind of hard to move on, but we probably should get started, or something like that, that acknowledges sort of the solidarity space into the business space, which is a new pragmatic move in most varieties of American English anyway. And so those are the kinds of uncertain language patterns even we want to be sure learners have the language skills to work with. Also, extending learning beyond the classroom. We know these skills matter elsewhere. They're often used in other places for job interviews, for placement, for different pieces. And promoting motivation. Again, we talked about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. and promoting risk tolerance and intentionality. This is a really, really key piece of successful language learners. We see over and over again the notion of tolerance to ambiguity and risk-taking as part of what makes interaction effective. Most importantly, and I'm going to say this over and over again, making students active agents in their own learning as they engage with different types of activities. We see this also in the gaming literature. Again, this is a slide from Back to the Basics, and I really wanted to highlight that this is still true. It's also true that we don't have a ton of, we have more, absolutely. It's not that there's no research on digital games and play and language learning. There's actually quite a nice body out there, and a huge shout out to those of you in this room, quote unquote, doing this work as well. But we still need to know more about how and the very clear specifics of specific mechanics, which may or may not contribute to the facilitation of hypothesis testing, whether that's moving things around or touching things or playing in a digital game environment. And we need to know more about what that means for learning outcomes, maybe in terms of proficiency, and proficiency models are really helpful in a lot of spaces, but also maybe for other things like domain-specific language or language revitalization and those kind of spaces where we don't have as clear of models of what counts as success or what doesn't count as success as we go forward. Again, I'm going to say this over and over and over again. The goal of the kind of work that we're doing with mixed reality is around always pedagogy, language, and behavior. The tech is really cool, and I think it'll be fun to show you some of those projects. But the technology is really just a facilitator for helping students take more and more agency in their own learning, as well as promoting deep thinking and inquiry into that particular space. And that is what each of these different experiences that I'm going to show you today is designed to do as we go forward. So moving on to part 2 of this talk, now that we've hopefully situated this work in language as being co-constructed and dynamic and consistently changing, and one of our goals of pedagogy is preparing ourselves, preparing learners to engage in that environment towards, okay, cool. So Julie, what are you talking about with mixed reality experiences? And I should tell you, actually, even in the tech world, we've moved away from the idea of mixed reality as a term. It's now transmedia or multimodal. So the notion of really the creation of play-oriented experiences that are immersive game-like, usually they have narratives and simulations, much like other kinds of game genres we see, where participants complete collaborative, multi-step scenarios in order to unpack critical knowledge related to targeted language functions. Now, those language functions might be certain sets of vocabulary and lexical items, certain structural pieces. They might be pragmatic or more function-oriented. They might be cultural as related to understanding schemata and background in the community in which we work. But regardless, they are created in order to engage deeply in that space. In all of the scenarios I'm going to show you, these have both analog components, meaning things you can touch and work with, as well as digital components and virtual and augmented reality kind of overlaid. I should say, and I want to front some of this work, is that this is what we're doing, and these are the ways we're figuring this out as we go. We could totally change. I could say 2 years from now, actually the data is telling us something really, really different. We don't know yet. And so we're asking a lot of questions, and I'll conclude my talk with a number of those questions that my team is working on and that others are working on in this area as we go. One key thing we have found that we need to differentiate is, even though we know all mixed reality experiences kind of share these features, they're play-oriented, they're immersive, they're collaborative, and they're multi-step, right, as related to this specific knowledge, there are really different instantiations of them, and we want to think about them as distinct spaces. And so for the second half of this talk, I'd really like to spend some time talking about 3 types and distinguishing between those 3 types of experiences. The first is what we would call facilitated mixed reality experiences, or maybe integrated mixed reality experiences. And those are experiences that are facilitated in specific classroom environments over a period of time. In this case, the first example I'm going to show you is Guzman, can you avert disaster by apprehending the art thief while you learn Spanish? This particular facilitated experience was created for intermediate low learners of Spanish who are working in a high school classroom. It integrates with the Interlocutors textbook. And it involves 3 phases, and those phases have been implemented now in 2 different ways, and we're seeing very minimal differences in that implementation in terms of learning outcomes, although some of that data has been halted because we're just getting back into face-to-face classrooms, and you need the work to be able to do that. You need to have students in groups, etc. But our first data collection session was March of 2020, so you can imagine how that started. In phase 1, what they have to do is they find out one of the secret agents is missing. They have to do deep reading. You can see this letter here where they actually have to read through. They have to solve a puzzle that's embedded. It's a spelling puzzle. So we're asking them to really think about accuracy in this case, right? But accuracy in the service of a very clear notification of what's happening there. And it requires deep reading, which is one of the key pieces that we want to happen for learners as they're looking at multimodal language, right? From there, then they listen to a secret listening passage. It's a weather report. They have to use augmented reality technology, which is built in this app here. You can see the sample of we call it the Vault Modulator, which is a facilitative app to do the digital part of this gameplay experience. And as they listen, then they are required to pick which postcard represents the weather report that they hear. The really cool part of this type of facilitated experience that's happening in the classroom as part of one of the lessons is that they listened up to 6, 7, 8 times in order to get the right answer. And so we see this deep engagement in the listening process, which those of you who do listening on a daily basis or on a weekly basis in a language course know sometimes can be a challenge, right? Either we see learners sort of shut down and give up if it's too difficult, or they just want to listen once and kind of get the right answer. The technology then facilitates feedback to happen because you overlay an augmented reality image over that. And if you're correct, then it triggers sort of the next places of the game. One of the key pieces, those of you interested in designing these experiences, is ensure you can't just use augmented reality to cheat your way through an experience. It's something we worked with a long time to make sure couldn't happen in this particular game, although sometimes it still does because learners are really good with the tech. Finally, there's deep engagement with the structural pieces. This is a set of text messages with an embedded puzzle, but the bolded words highlight suggestion, vocabulary, and structure that you need to make good suggestions in Spanish. Once you've figured out that you have to go to Colombia, you then arrive and have to figure out what to do. And we use a number of different ciphers and puzzle clues integrated with cultural material from the chapters. So you can see art from art museums, you can see different locations and places. These clues here are ciphers that directly relate to a phrase they have to fill out to figure out where to go. In order to decode the cipher, they use the images in this art, which associate it with particular letters. And so integrating, again, this multimodality as you're working. Key to this type of mixed reality experience being that it's fully integrated, in this case, in the classroom experience. There are wraparound activities, which I'll show you at the end, that a teacher engages with, that you play, then you do something, you do reflection, you think about how it relates to the other content of the textbook. Finally, in phase 3, you actually have to apprehend the art thief. You'll see this looks much like Realia that was created. We use a 360 video, so you can walk around the streets and kind of find the information you need at the museum, and then you trace a subway map that we've created. You do different things to find the gate. In this case, you tear the boarding pass. You move it over on top of the shadow. Hopefully you can see that on the tarjeta de embarque, the boarding pass there, and it tells you what gate to go to. Also, similarly, we engage them in deep reading around this particular infographic. You'll notice the spots below. Those of you who like puzzles, I'll try not to give all the puzzles away, but these particular experiences then enable, again, facilitate reading for different purposes. In this case, it's looking at details, and the wraparound activities then further extend how to use the vocab, how this information is related to the culture of the chapter and the culture of medios de transporte and what that looks like. And so facilitated mixed reality really is these gameplay experiences with then a teacher's guide, wraparound activities. In this case, we have them dive in again back into these text messages, even if they've solved the puzzle. It helps. We have lots of data where learners say like, yeah, I remember when I was solving the puzzle, I didn't quite get this part, but I've set it aside. So then when we could come back, those kinds of behaviors, which is exactly what we want to see, right? We want them to engage and then also kind of work through that as needed with different levels of facilitation. One of the other questions, which we'll talk about, is who needs what kind of facilitation when? And it becomes really, really clear in these gameplay experiences because they're either stuck or they're not. And so then there are a series of ways we can use, techniques you can use to sort of help learners get unstuck. The newest facilitated experience that we are building, it was originally all digital. It is you crash land on the moon. It is focused on teaching general pragmatic principles. And so you have to figure out principles of politeness, solidarity, power, and so rank of imposition, or how big or small something is. In order to do that, you have to activate 4 power crystals. Each one of those 4 power crystals is directly tied to the key content that we're trying to teach them. In this case, you look at different questions up here. You can see the Biromaxi, or the people living on the planet, the aliens living on the planet where you land, and you have different utterances that you use. And once you pick the correct utterance, you trace the path and it gives you a code word at the end. There are 4 different puzzles like that as they go through, and there is a field notebook that helps them walk through what those might be. This is an example from the captain's log of what that looks like. And again, this is facilitated. We have put this in 3 different types of classrooms. It's gone into an IB classroom around knowledge and inquiry and language and the way that it works. It was also used this summer with Fulbright teacher training programs and student training programs on how to think about intercultural communication and ways that that can be used. Key is there is the implementation of the game experience and then the facilitation around that that helps sort of process some of those pieces. We are in the process right now, actually, of transferring this from a fully digital experience to a mixed method or multimodal mixed reality experience, in that the book now will actually be printed and you have cards that you move around. And one of the big research studies coming up in the spring is actually comparing the two. Is there any difference between mixed reality with analog and digital as compared to the same principles implemented in a fully digital environment? The reason, of course, it was created fully digital was because of the pandemic. And how do we do this work when we can't be in the same room? We can't be all together, sort of close together. So that's one adaptation that we're trying to figure out. The second set of, or the second type of mixed reality experiences that we've been thinking about a lot, take out some of the facilitation piece, some of the very explicit facilitation piece for learning, and instead sort of just see what happens, kind of pop-up mixed reality. That's what we're calling it, or at least that's what I'm calling it for now. Pop-up mixed reality are around events. This happens to be an event that we did in the summer of 2019. It's called Mavericks the Fold. It was designed to use play and mixed reality experiences to facilitate innovation and discussion around how to use technology and language learning together. Much of course, what we see in the commercial market in terms of language and technology isn't this type of digital work, right? We have a lot of apps around vocabulary learning, around grammar practice, maybe some around sort of pronunciation, patterning anyway, about standard dialects. And so we wanted to get leaders from industry into the same room as leaders from language learning and teaching and talk about ways to use innovation to change some of the trajectory of what's being produced on the commercial market. In this case, it was about how do we sort of advance this notion of language learning pedagogy outside of the academic world. And we used play, or a pop-up experience. This was actually built and facilitated at a winery. They did 5 rooms over a day-long event. And you can see examples here of the analog and the digital. This is an augmented reality overlay on the right-hand side that's being used to find secret codes, etc. Key here is the content of this particular experience was non-important. It was just a narrative to make the collaboration happen. And as we talk about the design pillar, you'll see in the facilitated pop-up experience or the facilitated mixed reality experiences, the goal is using reflection, facilitation, and the play for the learning of that specific content. The goal of pop-up experiences is using facilitation and play to advance sort of the larger collaborative agenda and getting people talking with one another around often difficult topics, around cultural topics. This works very well for advanced learners who are diving into difficult spaces. In the end, what you have to do, this is another example from that same experience, you have to come up, you have to find all these different squares from the fluxus capacitor, that's what we call it. Once all the squares are there, it explodes. There's a huge thing that happens in the room, and the people that had been kidnapped, which is what you're trying to figure out, come back. We then sort of debrief about these topics and use the play experience to get strangers connecting with each other very quickly. We have about 100 hours of data that we're sorting through to figure out what happens with group compilation and collaboration, because the key research questions around these projects are, well, what kind of configuration gets the best collaboration? Is the gameplay that important? Could you do less design and more facilitation? And or more, what does that look like? Does this common goal sort of this last one matter? And what are those particular pieces? So again, the difference between facilitated and pop-up being sort of what the goal of that is. Similarly, this is kind of a conglomerate and gives a good example of how these types or categories are often kind of fuzzy border type distinctions. This is from a summer camp that we did around building mixed reality experiences and using those to create narrative and literacy skills in learners. We did a week-long summer camp. There's some facilitation here, of course, but it's not about the content of the rooms themselves, which is what makes it different. It's a pop-up event where the play and the building itself facilitates the type of collaborative learning we want to happen. In this case, we were teaching kindergarten through fifth graders how to tell stories, how to work with patterning in language, which of course is critical both to multiliteracy and even just L1 literacy, and how to collaborate in groups, which, as you can imagine, can be really, really difficult, especially the more excited you get about your idea. In this case, you have to rescue the chickens from the exploding space station before the bomb goes off. The whole escape experience, the mixed reality experience, goes all the way along that table. And what's really, really cool about this type of pop-up experience is the gameplay facilitated all the things the students wanted to avoid. So the number of conversations that I had about, I don't want to work in a group, I'll build it by myself. You just can't build these types of experiences by yourselves. And so again, the pop-up play mixed reality experiences designed around creating collaboration. Again, it's multimodal. The tech is very simple, but very useful. This is I think there was a buggy, or a prince was kidnapped on a planet. There's lots of space travel and ocean travel in these kids' experiences, which was really fun. But they were trying to figure out even how to collaborate and work together. And that was one of the key pieces. And so in both of the pop-up examples, though markedly different in terms of the actual implementation, the purpose is the same, which is using play to facilitate collaboration around difficult issues and topics that might be otherwise difficult to talk with, at least as a catalyst for really deep kind of work in this area. In all instances, you have facilitation and work, but not as intentional as what we see in those facilitated. Here's another example. I thought you'd enjoy seeing the type of cipher puzzles that kids create. It's really exciting. This was a second grade group that was creating a secret language. So each symbol creates a letter, and those were hidden within the balloons. You pop the balloons and you can decipher the secret code. Of course, secretly for me, they're doing all kinds of language work, morphology and structure while they're doing it. And they don't even really know it until we get to the end. And I'm like, look, you created all these new words. What? What's happening there? We're doing something similar right now in their after school program around language learning. So they're a Carmen Sandiego type experience where they're learning certain sets and phrases across 10 different languages. So moving away from the notion it's kind of expertise in one towards what happens if you could do this, all the same functions in these different languages, and that play sort of facilitated that work for more than just memorizing a bunch of words and doing coloring sheets, for example. One more example of the type of images you see in these pop-up experiences. I think it's something we haven't seen a lot of in the literature are younger kids, elementary school kids doing games and play and this work. And I can tell you they are every bit as creative, if not more so, and excited to build games as some of the teachers and students that we work with. Finally, the last one is event-driven. These are experiences that we create. They're short-term. They're 1 hour long at the most that engage people in an event, and they have two different functions. One is getting people to explore the area in which they're in. This happens to be a Washington, D.C. experience, and so you can go out into Washington, D.C. This was created for the ACTFL conference in Washington, where they work together, and teachers and leaders and facilitators had to sort of figure out what was happening. They're presented with this urgent quest. This happened in the big convention center, those of you who've been to ACTFL, and they found out that the power of language is slowly evaporating. Multiple historians, archaeologists, and curators are reporting the destruction and disappearance of various artifacts, presumably in an effort to erase the importance of communication and the very power of words from present knowledge. You'll notice there are misspellings on purpose. There's a clue for you. And so this urgent quest then becomes something, it's a one-page thing that they work with. In Calico in Montreal, we had to vanquish the ghost, McTavish the ghost. In Oregon, we had sort of a iteration. Once they get that quest, they are given a code. That code is found in that initial puzzle, and they unlock the vault modulator. So out in the world, this really combines some of the work that I have done with place-based learning and mixed reality and how they go together. Then they explore DC. This is a map that is on the back. Some of you may have even done this experience, but it's really about integrating the media. You see there's some Instagram work there related to art that's at the National Portrait Gallery. They then walk from the convention center down to a museum and see these different places along the way. The Instagram clues, of course, lead to portraits at the Portrait Gallery. Our goal is always to reveal things that people don't typically see. So using mobile devices and technology to get you to look up instead of look down. This is something we've been working on since Chris Holden and I built some place work in Albuquerque. And the goal is, oh my gosh, I didn't even know this was here, right? What's happening? And these event-driven scenarios then can be used to sort of see a place more deeply when you don't get to do that. You're just there for a short time, et cetera. And I'll talk a little bit about a project we're working on now related to that. In this case, this is Ford's Theater. We have the steps, and you have to count the number of steps, which of course is much easier than that when you're there. We do have a virtual version of this experience if anyone wants to try it out. You don't actually have to go to Washington, D.C. I'd be happy to share that with anyone who would like it. In the end, they get to the museum, they get to a secret location at Calico. We all ended up at a bar together hanging out. It was great, 125 people kind of connecting around the conference and working together. We are now working on using event-driven scenarios in tourism context to look at multilingualism in cities in the United States. So to highlight stories of multilingualism, multiculturalism that are typically hidden or people don't see when they're at these kind of more touristy places. So we are just starting out that work. It's called Sight Unseen. It's a project that really is the goal to, again, use these experiences to get people to engage differently. Hopefully, families are out there with different people looking at multilingual content. It would be great if they learned different languages as they're going along. So those are the three types, right? So we have facilitated in these classroom space, or at least the three types the way we've been thinking about them for now. Again, that might change. The sort of longer term implementations that are facilitated and work, the ways that play can be used to catalyze other language work, collaboration, deep connections, and then finally event-driven scenarios. In order to do this, what we needed to do is figure out what we know and what we don't know about design and creation. And so I want to spend the rest of this talk, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end, talking about some of these design pillars. This is a version of this work is coming out next year in French, Derridix, Knight, and Sykes, but there will hopefully be an English version as well soon. These four design pillars are drawn from if you think of it as sort of an interdisciplinary literature review, both from the work that I've done kind of empirically on games and learning and others in the area of CALL, as well as what's happening with art and play and kind of more broadly looking at those spaces. The first is there has to be designed under specification and the creation of what we call participatory infrastructures for agency and co-creation. By creating this under specification, you're encouraging engagement, encouraging users to look around and gain information from their environment, and even more so from some of Hellerman, Thorne, and Haley's work looking at group and sense making in that immediate moment. The same group could play the same experience at different times and have really different outcomes. And so that's okay, actually. The goal is that this under specification is designed right in to ensure that's what's happening, because especially in pop-up experiences, we want them to make their own sense. The goal is that the users, and whether we're talking about playing the games we built or building their own, that learners and participants are able to kind of create their own sense making, which when we get back to language really matters, because once you have sort of basic level proficiency, you go out into the world and need to make sense of language you encounter that you've never seen before. And it happens all the time. Pragmatic models, of course, being key to that. I'm not talking a ton about the models themselves in terms of pragmatics today, but it's underlying all this work, right? It's underlying how people engage, how we understand multilingual interactions, et cetera. Some examples of how this is done. I showed you a similar map. This is a map of the University of Oregon. So again, it guides exploration, but you don't have to visit all these places in specific orders. You don't have to do one thing before another. And also each of the different environments, when you actually walk to these flags, all of a sudden it makes sense. You use that information from the environment to solve the puzzle itself. And in this case, McTavish, instead of being vanquished from Montreal, was actually, he went to Oregon. And so people who did both experiences got to work with both of those. Similarly, this comes from the Guzman experience that I showed you earlier. Again, designed under specification. There are no instructions on how to use this decoder. There's nothing that says, make sure you look at the colors first and then the stars. But the puzzles themselves actually require you think about word order. They require you think about the stars as being indicative of when and how you might use them, or order. And so in figuring that out, we're facilitating those key discovery skills that are so important to long-term kind of language use and growth, etc. Similarly, we had no idea. The truth is we piloted all of these tests, but we have no idea how the participants are going to engage with these spaces, how they're going to put the squares up. And so in creation, one of the key pieces, and I would say this is true of pedagogy as well for language teachers, is creating conditions under which exploration and things you never imagined could happen do happen. Because we've seen this over and over again. We see it in task-based learning. We see it in curriculum design. We see it in project-based learning. We might build it, and they may come and they may not, but it's really about how they are given the opportunity to engage with that content. Some of the very worst, quote unquote, and I say worst just in terms of how people talk about good and bad activities, can be used really well by learners and can be really effective in learning, and vice versa. And so it's about creating these dispositions, which games and play are especially good at. Also, integrating frames and schema, or what we might call narrative and gameplay, and the use of fail states. I think John and Steve and we've been talking about this for a long time, right? In the sense that fail states do create the experiential learning, right? That is where the learning happens, the people at the center of that, and letting the classroom sort of expand and contract based on the needs of those learners as they're working with it. And so in doing so, getting the opportunity to try and do something new and revise and do something new allows that to happen, while also enabling us to scale it to classrooms. Because when you have 300 students, say, you need something that can be used to both create the scenario, but also ensure you know if they know the vocab, know if they're able to do these kind of language skills out on the fly. And these types of experiences do that, because we can see when you're able to solve the puzzle, if they're well-constructed puzzles, you need the language to solve the puzzle, and as a result we can see those outcomes. Likewise, if you have to try it 10, maybe 15 times, maybe not as many depending, that also creates that notion of failure. In this case, this is an augmented reality puzzle. These are some teachers and some people you all might know working on that. But it also has to use multimodality and context and real worldness to get people doing it. There's absolutely no reason, this is my colleague Kelly Yarian here at the University of Oregon, there is no reason she had to put on that wig. Right? There was no goal that she had to. We just put out a bunch of costumes in case the participants wanted to sort of expand and use embodiment and enactment to do this work. And it was great. People had all kinds of things, hats and eye patches, and did things. And in doing so, they authenticated that as being something exciting to them. It was fun to be out. It was great to do this. And it sort of unfolded in ways that we had no idea. So giving the opportunity to do that, and then physically embody some of these different pedagogies as well. And you can see that in this image here. Another way that we think about multimodality, of course, is in a much more traditional way. We have listening and reading and writing and augmented reality, virtual reality, videos, audio built into each of these experiences. We've also done more and more work with this kind of makerspace and hands-on experience when learners create their own experiences and draw them. Even in some of the work we've been doing with teachers is having them draw by hand some of these puzzles instead of worrying about how to create it in a Word document, for example, and what do we do with that? Similarly, this is one that's in the facilitated experience, and we know that multimodality, when we're targeting very specific language learning skills, is critical. We've seen that in a bunch of the CALL research as well. And so in this way, we have magnets that they have to move around, and the magnets were really key because they needed to be able to stick and put the magnets, which are the ones on the right, in order. And so that sort of enactment of that multimodality mattered as they were reading and listening and working with these other complex language features. Finally, the last pillar we think about a lot is what we call facilitation for immediate and possible futures. And that happens in two ways. One is the really key piece of feedback. Feedback that is comprehensible and doesn't compromise learning, as well as feedback that is timely. So if you can't solve a puzzle, making sure we have the right level of hints, making sure it's the right amount of information. If we look at some of the very well-known literature on sociocultural theory and feedback, it works well to think about sort of that scaffolded feedback in terms of how we think about hints. In this way, that feedback could be that they just don't solve the puzzle and they need that, but it also could be that, hey, if you kind of rearrange these letters or think about language in this way, it will be very different. Similarly, these types of puzzles in this phase 3 in this facilitated experience get feedback in two ways. You get immediate feedback during the gameplay itself. The fail state space is a feedback space, but also you get delayed feedback when you come back and look at those wraparound and reflective practices. And what we've seen so far, at least anecdotally, is that learners are able to draw on that content and say, no, I really struggled with this piece. I don't know what those words mean. Can we go over that? And ask really targeted questions in terms of the, feedback and kind of possible futures they would like. Similarly, what we know about this sort of idea of possible futures is if we think about pop-up experiences, specifically and event-driven mixed reality scenarios, the goal is to get people continuing to talk about that experience. And whether or not the gameplay experience, this one, am I going too fast? The Mavericks experience here, we call it, right? This pop-up experience, whether or not the actual gameplay gets remembered, we have lots of network reporting that people are still collaborating and working together on projects really tangible to technology and language learning. Apologies for my slide movement there. So the last question, and I was excited to talk about some of this new stuff and how these pieces work and kind of the theory behind what we're doing. And I also want to mention, right, the goal is where are we going and getting to really look at some of this. And I want to say this over, I know we've been saying this for a long time, but data. It's something I'm starting to pay a lot more attention to, but also very specific data around mixed reality experiences. There is a special issue in progress right now of the Caillois journal that is coming out on mixed reality. And I think the data that we see out of that issue, I'm hoping and hopeful that that's the kind of thing we can start asking ourselves. It might be a year from now, I tell you that all this anecdotal work we see, all the positive outcomes we're seeing, aren't what we thought and aren't happening because of what we thought. And so I really am interested, and I think we're all interested in figuring out what that looks like. Some key questions, and I'm hopeful, and these could be dissertation topics, these could be long-term research projects, and anyone interested in collaborating, please let us know. I think there's more data here and more work to be done than any sort of team can do alone. So interesting in how do MREs compare to other game genres? Are they the same? Are they different? Does the analog matter? In what ways do they work well? In what ways do they not? We know these three types. I think there's enough data to say these three types do work differently, even though the gameplay mechanics are very similar. But also, how do they contribute to skill and topic and timing? And finally, a question is digital versus multimodal. Now that we are going to have two versions, two of the exact same game built in two different modalities, we're really interested in comparing for intercultural communicative competence and pragmatic learning, which one works better? Does the enactment and the embodiment of those physical items really change how we interact with the material, or does it matter at all? Because of course there's cost and there's design and all kinds of things. Also a question I've been asking for a while in all kinds of game genres, but is high fidelity as compared to low fidelity design, does it even matter? Should it matter? In what ways does it matter? I think is probably a better question. And then finally, learners as builders. I think our experience over the course of the last year and summer with students out in camps and young kids says, like, they can really do this. And what could we do if we gave the same experience to older kids? How do those compare? And getting multiliteracy and languages into schools earlier, of course, is always a goal of ours at Castles. With that, I think I left the time for questions. That was the goal, 15 minutes. We just made it. And I really look forward to talking about this more. Again, this is in progress work on purpose. It was intentional to show you kind of where we're at and what's happening in the area of call and innovation as we think about new technologies going forward. I will put my email here for anyone interested in doing this work. Also, I believe Blanche is on your organizing committee. You should check with her. We're working on starting to work eventually on a pretty cool game, mixed reality, for some of her work. So check that out as well. And with that, I will stop my screen share and hopefully be back in the right platform for question answering. There we go.
Thank you, Dr. Sykes. It's so good to see you. Myself and Blanca are going to be checking out the questions on our site and on Zoom. I just want to say really quickly, it's so cool to see again what you've been up to at Castles and with all those familiar faces. It's just so impressive and looks, as usual, so fun, especially with the kids, right? So, but yeah, I'll go ahead and just be monitoring the chat, and so will Blanca. So if anybody has a question, we'll go ahead and direct them to Dr. Sykes.
Yeah, please do.
You could also use the raise your hand feature on Zoom if you'd like, or whatever you prefer to ask your question. You could also unmute.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Sykes. Thank you for the talk. It was really impressive. And at the end, when you're looking into the future, there's a question that digital versus multimodal. And I want to know more about that because I don't know like how you perceive the relationship between those two. And just could you please explain a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's probably maybe a false dichotomy, but the example I'm thinking of is we have the intergalaxial, the space exploration experience that's built on a website. So you can actually go now, I could even show you, you can go and you can do everything just doing the gameplay and entering everything online. You wouldn't have to leave your desk, for example. What we have been doing mostly in mixed reality is that you have some of it in the app in what we call the modulator. So there is digital, right? There's absolutely augmented reality. We have VR 360 video. We have voice speech to text, right? So we can get voice and production in there. But we also have things like postcards and magnets and maps. And we know that physical experience can be really helpful. So often, right, when we're reading, sometimes we'll print something out and highlight it, and there's different modalities. And so I'm really interested in the mixed reality experience itself, is what happens if you have the physical space, the physical enactment, the embodiment of those resources with the digital, or the ones that are all online. My guess is, if I'm hypothesizing, it doesn't matter for some and it really matters for others. And some of that might have to do with neurodiversity. Some of that might have to do with just how people learn, although it's hard to know sort of how we operationalize that. But I think, yeah, one of the key pieces is it worth printing the stuff, right? It might be worth doing both digital and sort of enhancing that with print materials. Yeah, we don't know though. The data, we don't have the data yet, but we will. So it's coming. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Dr. Sykes. We're going to move on to a question by Michael, and then I think we'll move on to the third question in a second.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. First, thank you for your presentation. It was very insightful. And one of the things that occurs to me is kind of the idea of escape rooms.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about the way that teachers are trying to teach language, but don't necessarily have a high level of internet literacy, perhaps, or there's other limitations. And I was thinking about how a lot of, for example, you can order an escape room in a box that deals with websites that kind of interacts and would be good for a, you know, a more advanced level. But I was wondering your take on these particular types of facilitated mixed reality, and how valuable you think it would be to integrate that sort of task in the classroom.
Yeah, I think all the data points towards very valuable. We've spent most of this past year actually teaching teachers how to build low fidelity versions of this work. I think it's valuable in two ways. One, in terms of the teacher training, it gets at some of the pedagogical challenges that we've been working with in teacher training for a long time, which is how do we push into this learner-centered space, some of the basic kind of pedagogy work of reshaping learner and inquiry-oriented pedagogy and some of that work. So even just having to think about designing your own puzzles for learners matters. We did some work last June with the high school teachers here in Eugene, and they made incredible stuff for their students. From the learning perspective, yeah, my students love it. So I actually now have an escape room, essentially. I mean, it's mixed reality escape room, whatever we want to kind of call it. It's not in a room, right? So I think of escape rooms as kind of this embodied, but in a box is a great way to think about it. We actually do it now twice a term as a review for my students in my SLA class, in Language and Power, in language learning classes, and they love it. We did it in a way, actually did a Kahoot, kind of a trivia day as a composed, and then the next day review was the escape room experience. In this case, you had to recover the stolen heirloom corn seeds. I mean, it was a very silly narrative, right? And what I found over and over again is they like the trivia. They like, most students do, right? But they want it. But can we have a copy of that? Can I use that for my test? What do I do? How do we do that? And so my experience thus far is it's worked really well. During the pandemic, when the kids were at home with me for 18 months, we did an escape room in a box every week, because I decided that for a second grader and a fourth grader, literacy was one of the things that could get lost pretty quickly. And so instead of saying we're going to, we read, of course, we read books and do all of those things too. But for me, the notion of them having to dig through escape room materials, and they could do it. It wasn't, I was there to help, and we've done lots and lots of those as research as a team. But yeah, I think super effective. And the commercial, there's enough commercial work out there now. You wouldn't actually have to build your own. I also was just talking with I can't remember who it was, and I want to give them credit, so I will try to remember that. Maybe one of my graduate students here. But we were talking about, what if you took the escape room in a box and just modified it to be multilingual? So you didn't have to do all the design elements, you didn't have to build all the stuff, but you actually put language content right on top of that, and use that to have learners do it, right? And so the idea is they actually then modify their own escape rooms, because that's one of the things.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thanks, Blanche, for the shout out for the escape room. If anyone wants to play the space, it's really hard.
I was just going to say, I'm so jealous of these new students now. I'm like, I missed out on something. But it's okay.
Yeah, well, come do it with us anytime.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we have a question from Dr. Smith next.
Yeah.
Yes, it's on Hubbard. So So the question is, can Dr. Sykes say a few words about how to do assessment of MREs? What counts as success?
Oh man, of course, it's the number one question, right? I think I think there are 3 levels of counting as success. One is completing it, right? I mean, I think part of that is if we build the puzzles right, being able to complete them means you know the knowledge. It means we've done it. And part of is understanding how to validate that and making sure they're the right kind of puzzles, which is always a problem in some games, right? It's some of the research we see in digital games and language learning is like, well, great, but that game never should have done that. Like, I'm not surprised that game didn't teach that skill. And so being really discerning about that, I think matters. But I also think success is not escaping, but deep engagement in the process. If we see learners who are in 2 puzzles for the entire hour, that actually tells us something. It means they're still willing to fail, even under conditions where we don't typically see that. In terms of a data model and measuring success, we're actually looking at 3 pieces. We're doing a pre and a post and a delayed post, and we're also going to look at patterns of use. And so what I'm interested in is, can we look at how different types of engagement during the process while you're playing change the outcomes, or do they? And if it doesn't matter, then that tells us something too. But yeah, so I think it's those 3 kind of levels as we go.
Nice, great, thank you. And I saw the thumbs up from Dr. Smith too. And I think we had another question from on Huva. It's Hannah, just to make sure we're or maybe Hannah, to make sure if that's the same question that we had on Huva. Because Blanca and I are both trying to monitor.
Yeah, that I posted some questions in Huva.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I can just read it out loud if we'd like, or you can read
That'd
it
be great. Yeah, no, that'd be great if you could.
Okay, so the question was, what did your team for building this curriculum and app look like? Oh, those are always the cool people over there.
Yeah.
What were the roles? How many people were involved, and how much time did it take?
Yeah, so it depends on which ones we're talking about. Usually our team is basically myself, Stephanie Knight, who's our assistant director, Christopher Deredix, who works on strategy and curriculum development, and then a graphic designer. We also have a tech team who built the app, but the app is now built, so I sort of take that one out of the equation. So it was a team of 4 people. You know, it takes some time. The Guzman experience was a significantly longer amount of time. It was about 2 or 3 months. But some of the, and the Mavericks one, of course, because there are 5 different rooms there, but some of the other experiences, we're working on one right now that we're working on for Pittsburgh for AAAL. So the idea, the hotel happens to be close to a gentrified African-American neighborhood there. And so we're working on how do we get people into that neighborhood to, you know, spend money there and really support what's happening, and working with some local people there. And that one is, you know, it's a weekly meeting every 2 weeks. It's probably a 40-hour experience to build for the 1 hour kind of event driven. So it really depends on how complex they are. I will tell you though, some of the ones we built in Google Slides and in more simple spaces, it's a couple hours. Just like any other lesson plan that you would build once you have the principles down. And we do a number of workshops on kind of how to do that. In fact, early this morning, I was on East Coast time doing one of those workshops for teachers on how do we kind of do this without the low fidelity really matters, which is a key piece for equity, right? So in my role, our job is to create access and to create things we can share with all of you. So Guzman is available. If people are interested, just shoot me an email. But also, the goal is how do we help people build their own and with students. The kids who did their escape rooms this summer, they worked on let's count it up, 2-hour sessions, 3 days. So it was 6 hours or 7 hours, and that included the makerspace stuff. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I have an iOS certificate in programming for iOS apps, and so I'm like really interested in the technical side of it, but I don't know if you guys do anything with that. Because you said someone built the app for you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, we built the app in-house. We used to have a full technical team. We now sort of contract with a company here just because we're doing more complex things, and we needed a bigger team. But I think, yeah, the app itself, I mean, there's always room for, if you're interested in coding, we have a wish list of what we want there, but it's what we call the Vault Modulator. It's free. Any of you could download it. And it really delivers tasks and then does the augmented virtual reality voice to text and text entry that we need to make the puzzles work.
You guys do like support video or GIF? Because I teach sign language, so
We
printed stuff
support both.
doesn't work. Okay, awesome.
Nope, video and GIF, all the above. Yep.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. It had to be good for language learning of all types, so that really mattered.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We had another hand up here on the Zoom. I sent them a chat. They can go ahead and ask their question out loud, or if you wanted to type your question in the chat, whatever you prefer.
Thank you, Dr. Sykes. I really liked your presentation, and it's wonderful to meet you. I was wondering, you were talking about multimodality, and you were talking about how you are doing this entire project, and I think it's a working project. You just said it's a working project. So my question is, for people who don't have a very good internet connection, or they don't have those sort of tech facilities. I mean, like I am teaching in a private university in Bangladesh, and I would say the facilities that I am getting would be the best ones. And still the students who are living near the border of Bangladesh, like between Myanmar and Bangladesh, they don't get all the facilities because of some issues near the border. They actually get 3G internet facility, not the 4G even. So was there any aspect like this that came up in your research regarding the underrepresented context? That is my first question. And the second one would be, when we talk about multimodality, you said that the physical aspect of the game, and then there was this online aspect of the game, these two things you just talked about. So is there any, does it ever happen, or did it ever happen in your research? Did you see something where the physical aspect of the game kind of like overpowered the online aspect? Like the reason this traditional platforms, or the traditional learning platforms, or the quiz platforms, or the gaming platforms, they're so popular. I think one of the reasons would be because we can actually imagine a physical aspect of it in our real life. So last year when we switched to, the year before last year, when we switched to online learning, we completely switched to online learning. There was no hybrid or nothing at our university. And the first thing that we did would be to try to gamify the lessons a bit. Some of us actually tried to do that as language teachers, that was kind of like we were in survival mode. Yeah. Students, they were only focusing on grades and stuff. So that was kind of like our survival thing. So what I saw is that the reason why I started using those quiz platforms, because students could imagine a pattern of this in their real life that was quite similar to the real life thing they have done before. And also another thing is that they're comfortable with it. So was there any aspect like this when it comes to multimodality and digital aspect of the game? Does the physical part, or does the physical aspect actually overpower the digital aspect sometimes?
So to answer your first question, that the lack of connectivity is something we cared a lot about. So our app runs locally. You just need a connection to download, and then it runs completely separate. It's also why mixed reality has become kind of a focus. Just how do we get into schools, into neighborhoods, into all kinds of places with no connectivity? So yes, that is an issue. I think that we feel pretty comfortable in having solved is long, but in terms of the actual logistic piece. And your second question is a complicated one, and I know we don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to give the very short answer that I can. But my answer is we make decisions on what's digital and what's physical by what actually happens in the real world. So, for example, a book makes sense to be printed. A digital social media site should be digital. And so really drawing on the work from cultures of use work and the idea of using language the way that others use it outside of education has been really key. And so that makes it essential for thinking about how people might relate to language outside of the classroom, which makes that transition more seamless for us. So that's the short version. And I know we have to get to other sessions, but I'm happy to sort of talk about that more. But yeah, the decision is always, right? How do you connect? And it is true, the physical is an important piece. And to me, it actually doesn't matter if they would rather do physical than digital, as long as they're able to access the information.
Thank you so much.
My email, I'm absolutely happy to put my email in the chat. There you go. And
thank you so much. You're right. Yes, we are kind of cutting it close here now that we're, but we want to thank you so much, Dr. Sykes, for coming. I always laugh and say that I try to get you here from the moment I got here from Oregon, but it finally happened.
I'm delighted.
Yes. And then Blanche, of course, we're like, oh, okay. So it was a perfect timing. But we just wanted to remind everybody that our next panel on teaching and learning in times of COVID is at 1 p.m. Arizona time. So in a couple hours from now. And then we will have our next plenary at 4 p.m. Arizona time. But thank you all so much for coming to this session. Thank you especially to Dr. Sykes for imparting this wonderful, content with us. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been really lovely. So
yay, have a good day.
Nice to see all of you. It's wonderful.
Thank you, Dr. Sykes. And we'll see you again later for sure in our working session. We're very excited to have the opportunity to ask more questions about your research and about all the wonderful things you do for language teaching and learning. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for coming. I know it was early for some of you or very late, but we really appreciate having you all here. So we'll see you in a few hours.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.